So yeah, that was week 5 where you go into this, the expropriation of health. So what does, if we had a kind of ideal, kind of urbanist village that was ideally designed according to, Illich's worldview, what does the ideal kind of health system look like? Is it a kind of communitarian thing, or could you speak a little bit more about what that might look like?
Yeah, so I think in the towards the end where he presents a kind of positive alternative, he talks, as I said, about a different relation to anguish and to suffering and to pain. One of not pure acceptance, not a kind of absolute martyrdom to so on, but to understand that these things are part and parcel of everybody's life in that way. They're not something to be individually panicked or frightened about. And the fact is, we will all die, and death is a fact of life. And so this increasing hygienization of death and the elimination of death from the contemporary imaginary has very, very negative effects on how we understand pain, suffering, tragedy, but also joy, right? As well. So it would be to bring back, I suppose, an understanding of the centrality of suffering to humanity. But he says here that health designates a process by which each person is responsible, but only in part responsible to others. To be responsible may mean two things. A man is responsible for what he has done and responsible to another person or group. Only when he feels subjectively responsible or answerable to another person will the consequence of his failure be not criticism, censure, or punishment, but regret, remorse, and true repentance. The consequent states of grief and distress are marks of recovery and healing and are phenomenologically something entirely different from guilt feelings. Health is a task, and as such is not comparable to the physiological balance of beasts, and so on. I mean, it's a very kind of, different way of thinking, and I think especially something like the pandemic is going to pose a kind of critical challenge to what Illich is saying health is, because I think we're now so contemporarily conditioned to thinking about health as a kind of public safety health measure, and things like vaccines, and then all of the aspects of control that come along and the technocracy that come along with that. He is going to present a challenge to this. Right, and it may look like Illich is proposing something rather cruel, to suggest that man must kind of live fragilely and in relation to this experience of pain. And I think it relates to what Agamben was saying over the past year. I think Agamben is very Illichian, or vice versa, and I think the response to Agamben was largely extremely negative from the left. People thought that Agamben criticising the pandemic control measures and criticising, for example, the lack of the Pope going to sit with dying people and the fact that the church is closed and so on, was a kind of spiritual failure on the part of these institutions, right, according to Agamben. But the kind of initial response, if your only criterion for anything is people must be protected at all costs, then Agamben and Illich start to look like very dangerous thinkers, as if they're proposing something, purely almost evil, I suppose, from our contemporary perspective. And I think so it will be fascinating, I think, to understand why he's saying what he's saying here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just fascinating how this Catholic priest whose heyday was in the 70s is just so on point for so many different themes that are super relevant today. Not just one, not just two, but like 3 separate distinct themes that are hugely relevant right now. So yeah, it's really quite impressive. I think I understand what you mean when you said that Agamben said that the time of Illich's hour has come. It definitely sounds right. So in the final week 7, we go into this book, ABC, the alphabetization of the popular mind. And so this is kind of his take on issues of literacy, but also kind of information systems more broadly. So this seems to kind of really bring us up to perhaps yet another massive theme of the current moment, which is the information revolution and its effects on our psychology and relationships. So what do you see as most interesting in this book, or what's really at stake in this book in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, it's to do with systematization, and Illich kind of is always talking about institutions, but then he really is talking about systems, and the way in which systems then become dominant and start to kind of eliminate all these other aspects of human life. So, and this is co-written with Barry Sanders, so it's a joint authored text, just to note that. But it's to talk about the effect, if you like, the historical effect of literacy as such, basically, as a form of technology, right, as a kind of development within human civilization, and the way in which that then has a kind of impact on, I suppose, how we think and how we organize in general, right? So it's like, how does literacy and alphabetization and print and all of these kind of historical developments, which we of course accept almost non-dialectically as positives, right? Of course we think the mass literacy is a net good. If you think about Cuba's mass literacy project, or in the 20th century, you had huge socialist projects to kind of teach literacy to the masses and so on. But it's a kind of attempt to kind of go back before that moment, if you like, and to trace the origin of the text, I suppose, and as letters, as individual technological devices, I suppose. Like one of the first things you learn at school is your alphabet, right? If you haven't already learnt it before you went to school, and like Marshall McLuhan and various of these other thinkers, there's a way in which Illich wants to get behind the progress or the technology itself, and to think about what it's also lost and destroyed in that kind of production. So I think, and again, it's not one of his more popular books, but again, I think it's like, it's a kind of interesting addendum, basically, to thinking about technology and language as a technology, or language as a virus, as William Burroughs might say. And we're surrounded by ideologies constantly, or particular ideologies, like Althusser says, ideology is eternal. Like, we can't ever really get outside of ideology. And some languages, I mean, Anglo-American or whatever we want to say, are more powerful than others. There's something like incredibly hegemonic about, American English, you could say. Everyone is infected by it one way or another.
Right. It's also interesting to think about the whole kind of woke philosophy that's now increasingly ascendant, or arguably dominant at this point, is that it really is this kind of relatively simple system of words that you're supposed to say at certain times and places. And you can actually really reduce it to a relatively basic set of linguistic parameters, essentially. It's like this kind of highly defined language game where anyone can learn it. It's really pretty simple, and there's some really basic heuristics. And so and people do nowadays think of this as education, and you hear people say this, right? It's like, you need to get educated about racism, or like, you need to get, it's not my job to educate you. And so it's like, there's like this system, there's this basic kind of linguistic system that is taken to be correct and good and kind of morally normative. And it's also conflated with essentially education. It's like you need to learn this, truth of the world. And yet it's actually really just this like basic linguistic system. And so it's very fascinating to see how, what someone like Marcuse might have called, the kind of administration of society has really, really, truly kind of made its way into even contemporary institutionalized kind of like leftist thinking. And it just kind of, to me, this kind of resonates or rhymes a little bit with what we're talking about with Illich, because it basically is the application of a kind of administrative capitalist logic to words as somehow being as a model for what education means. And I think anyone with 2 cents kind of can take a step back and see that that's kind of insane.
Yeah, I mean, but it's very important. Therefore, we understand how this happens. How these languages or and no, I mean, I completely agree. And it becomes, like you say, language game, even a quite simple language game, that involves a series of tricks. It's like if someone says one thing, you know what the response should be. There's a series of mantras. There's always a series of like repeated phrases. You know, it's a kind of an assumed set of slogans or prescriptions that have this linguistic and increasingly viral character. Which then mitigate against things like nuance, complexity, disagreement, and history, and many other things. So I think it may be kind of a slightly oblique way into the question that you're raising to finish with Illich here. But I think, on the other hand, it might shed some light on how these forms of linguistic dominance or hegemony are possible.
Right.